3 weeks ago, a package arrived at my door with no return address, just my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a bear I hadn't seen in 23 years, a bear I watched my grandmother bury in the backyard when I was 6 years old. And underneath the bear, folded into a perfect square, was a hand-drawn map. I want you to understand something before I start. I am not someone who believes in signs. I don't chase conspiracy theories. I'm a 31-year-old accountant who drives a sensible car and files her taxes early. I'm the last person who should be standing here telling you that a package sent me on a journey that dismantled everything I thought I knew about my family. But here I am. Let me start at the beginning, not the package, but the bear. Name was Penny. I named her that when I was 2 years old because she had a copper-brown ribbon around her neck that my mother said looked like a shiny penny. Penny went everywhere with me. She was the kind of stuffed animal that becomes an extension of yourself, worn smooth in all the right places, missing one button eye that my mother kept promising to replace. I loved that bear the way only very small children can love inanimate objects, completely, without reservation. I don't remember everything about the summer I was 6, but I remember this. I woke up one morning and Penny was gone. I searched everywhere, under the bed, in the laundry, in the toy box. I asked my mother, who told me she hadn't seen her. I asked my father, who ruffled my hair and said bears sometimes go on adventures. I cried for 3 days. And about a week after Penny disappeared, I was playing in my grandmother's backyard while the adults sat on the porch. My grandmother, we called her Nana Alois, was in the garden near the old oak tree at the far edge of the property. I remember thinking she was planting something. She had her back to me and a small garden spade in her hand. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. I didn't connect what I saw until years later. Until I was maybe 11 or 12 and the memory floated back to me in that random way childhood memories do. My grandmother, the garden spade, the shape of what she was burying, small, soft, formless, a bear-shaped thing. I never said anything about it. I convinced myself I was wrong, that I had imagined it or misremembered. Nana Alois was a warm, fiercely loving woman who brought me soup when I was sick and taught me how to braid my own hair. She would never take Penny from me. That didn't make any sense. He passed away when I was 19, ovarian cancer, swift and cruel. I was in my first year of college when she died and I didn't handle it well. We were close. I was her only grandchild on my mother's side and she treated me like something precious. Losing her left a hole that I'm not sure I've ever entirely filled. After she died, the family sold her house. My mother managed the estate because she was an only child and her father had died before I was born. I helped pack boxes during a long weekend in November. We donated most of Nana's belongings, kept a few meaningful pieces. I remember walking through that backyard one last time, standing near the old oak tree, and feeling an ache I couldn't explain. I hadn't thought about Penny or about what I thought I saw that summer in years. Life moved forward the way it does. College, a job, an apartment, the rhythms of adulthood that push childhood further and further into the background. And then 3 weeks ago, Penny arrived at my door. I sat on my kitchen floor for I don't know how long just holding her. She was clean, recently washed, I realized. Someone had taken care of her. The missing button eye had been replaced and the copper ribbon was new, but it was the same shade, the same width. Whoever sent her had paid attention to details. The note attached to the map was short. It said, "She would have wanted you to have this, and she would have wanted you to know the truth. Follow the map. Burn this note after you read it." I didn't burn the note. I'm not dramatic enough for that. But I did photograph everything before I touched another thing. The map was drawn on what looked like a page torn from a journal. Heavy cream paper, slightly yellowed. The lines were precise and confident. Someone who knew how to draw, or at least someone who had drawn this particular map many times in their head. It showed a road I recognized immediately. The main road leading out of my grandmother's hometown, about 40 minutes from where I grew up. Then a turn onto a smaller road, then a dirt path, then a symbol, a small circle with an X inside it, next to what appeared to be an illustration of a stone wall. I grew up going to that town every other weekend. My grandmother's house was there, and I had a memory, vague but persistent, of a stone wall on the edge of an old property on the far side of town. A wall I had passed dozens of times without ever thinking about. I know what you're thinking. I thought it too. This could be anything. This could be someone's idea of a strange prank. This could be completely unrelated to my grandmother, and Penny could have simply ended up at a thrift store somewhere, and some well-meaning stranger found it with my name embroidered on the inside. Yes, my mother had embroidered my name inside all my stuffed animals, and tracked me down through some combination of luck and social media. But the map was specific, and whoever sent it knew about Penny, knew what she meant, knew that a replacement ribbon in exactly the right shade would communicate something. I drove to my grandmother's hometown on a Saturday morning in early spring. The stone wall was exactly where the map indicated. It ran along the edge of what had once been a farm property, long since subdivided and partly developed. The wall itself was old fieldstone, mortared together in that uneven way that suggests the 19th century rather than the 20th. It stretched about 60 feet, and ended at a crumbling corner post. I almost missed it. I walked the length of the wall twice looking for whatever I was supposed to find. Then I noticed that one section of the wall near the eastern end was slightly different from the rest. The stones were the same color, the same rough texture, but the mortar between them was newer, fresher. Someone had opened this section of the wall and resealed it, not recently. The mortar was weathered, maybe 10 or 15 years old, but definitely after the original wall was built. I want to be clear, I am a 31-year-old accountant. I do not go around prying open stone walls. But I had driven 40 minutes with a rescued childhood stuffed animal in my passenger seat, and there was something in me that simply couldn't stop. The stones in that section were loose. They came free with less effort than I expected, maybe because someone had designed them to. Behind the third layer of stones, wrapped in an oilcloth that had kept everything dry and intact, was a metal tin. And inside the tin were three things: a photograph, a letter, and a small key. I sat down in the dead grass next to that stone wall, and I opened the letter first. It was in my grandmother's handwriting. I have to stop here for a moment because I need you to understand what that meant. My grandmother had been dead for 12 years, holding a letter in her handwriting. That looping, distinctive cursive I knew from birthday cards and recipe notes was one of the most disorienting experiences of my life. My hands were shaking. I had to read the opening line 4 times before it actually penetrated. It said, "My darling girl, if you are reading this, then someone has finally found the courage I couldn't manage. Please know that everything I did because I thought I was protecting you. I know now that I was wrong. I'm going to tell you what the letter contained, but I want to do it the way my grandmother told it, slowly, with the weight it deserves." My grandmother had a sister. Her name was Margaret. They were born 3 years apart and were close in the way that sisters who have survived hard things together are close. Their family had very little money. Their father was unreliable, and their mother held everything together through a combination of stubbornness and sheer will. The sisters relied on each other completely. My grandmother was 24 and Margaret was 21. Margaret fell in love with a man named Daniel. He was charming and handsome and came from a family with land and money, which was the kind of thing that mattered enormously in their world at that time. My grandmother never trusted him. She saw something behind the charm that made her uneasy, though she couldn't name it precisely. She warned Margaret. Margaret didn't listen. Margaret married Daniel in 1962. For 3 years, things seemed fine. Then they weren't. My grandmother didn't go into specifics in the letter, but she wrote that Margaret came to her in 1965 with bruises she was trying to hide, and that this was not the first time. My grandmother wanted to go to the police. Margaret begged her not to. In 1965, in a small town, going to the police about your husband was not what women did. My grandmother understood this even though she hated it. In 1966, Margaret became pregnant. My grandmother prayed that a child would change something. It didn't. In the spring of 1967, Margaret disappeared. The official story, the story my grandmother had lived with and maintained for the rest of her life, was that Margaret had left, run away, abandoned her marriage and her newborn daughter because she couldn't handle the responsibility. Daniel told this story and the town believed it because Margaret had always been considered a little wild, a little unreliable, following her own rules. My grandmother's protests that this wasn't true, that Margaret would never abandon her daughter, were quietly dismissed. Daniel raised the baby himself. He remarried within 2 years. The baby, Margaret's daughter, was raised by the new wife, who was cold but not cruel. My grandmother was allowed limited contact. She poured into that little girl every bit of love she couldn't give Margaret. The little girl was my mother. I had to read that sentence 3 times. My mother, Margaret's daughter. The baby Daniel had claimed to raise alone after his wife ran away. My grandmother had known. She had known that her niece, my mother, was also effectively her ward, the child of her missing sister. She had raised my mother as if she were her own daughter, and my mother had grown up calling her Aunt Alois and having no idea that the woman who loved her most in the world was also the woman holding the most devastating secret in their family. The letter continued. 1987, my grandmother received an anonymous tip. She never found out who sent it or how they knew what they knew. The tip was a single sentence. The roses on the eastern side of the barn are not all that Daniel planted. My grandmother drove to the old farm property where Margaret and Daniel had lived. The farm had been sold years earlier. Daniel had moved away with his new wife after the property stopped being profitable. But the structure was still standing, and the overgrown rose garden on the eastern side of the old barn was still there. My grandmother found her sister. I cannot write those words without my throat closing. I cannot imagine what that day was like. I cannot imagine being 60 years old and finding your little sister in the ground, after 20 years of telling yourself she had just left, that she was somewhere living her life, that you would see her again. My grandmother did not go to the police. I know that sounds incomprehensible, but the letter explains it in a way that, while I don't fully agree with her choice, I can understand. Daniel was dead by 1987. He had died of a heart attack 2 years earlier. Going to the police would have meant exhuming Margaret, identifying remains, opening an investigation into a dead man. It would have meant my mother, who was 20 years old and in college and just beginning her life, learning that her father had murdered her mother and her aunt had known and said nothing. It would have meant a scandal that consumed everything and resolved nothing, because the person responsible could not be prosecuted. My grandmother sealed her sister into the stone wall on the property across town, the old family property that Margaret had loved as a child, that had belonged to their grandmother before the land was sold. She laid her there with the dignity she deserved. And she took the evidence she had, a journal she found at the farm, photographs, a letter Margaret had written but never sent, and she sealed those too. She kept them safe against the day she thought my mother was ready to know. She never thought my mother was ready. She carried this alone for the rest of her life. Bare Penny was buried in the backyard as a marker, a private memorial, something only my grandmother would know the meaning of. When I was 6, when she took Penny from me, I believe she was in one of the darkest periods of her grief. Having the bear near my Aunt Margaret's memory was something she needed. I don't think she fully understood how much it would hurt me. Or maybe she did, and she was in too much pain to stop herself. The photograph in the tin was of my grandmother and Margaret, young, late teens, maybe early 20s. They were laughing at something off camera, arms around each other. My grandmother looked exactly the way I remembered her. Margaret looked like my mother. The key, I learned later, was to a safe deposit box at a bank in the nearby town. My grandmother had opened it years ago and paid the annual fee through a trust that continued payments after her death. Inside was Margaret's journal and the letter she had written to no one in particular, describing what Daniel had done to her and what she was afraid would happen. So who sent the package? Who sent Penny and the map? I spent 2 weeks trying to figure that out. The answer came from a neighbor of my grandmother's, an elderly woman named Ruth who had lived next door to Nana Alois for 40 years. Ruth had been my grandmother's closest friend, and Ruth had been the only other person in the world who knew. My grandmother had told Ruth everything in the final weeks of her illness. She asked Ruth to give it time, to wait until my mother was older, until circumstances felt right, until Ruth felt that the truth could do more good than harm. Ruth waited 12 years. She said she almost sent the package a dozen times and lost her nerve. What finally moved her, she told me, was clearing out a storage unit and finding a box of my grandmother's things that she had kept. Inside was Penny. Ruth said my grandmother had brought the bear to her a few months before she died. She said, "Keep this safe. One day it will be right to send it home." I have told my mother everything. That was the hardest conversation of my life, and I will not pretend it went smoothly. There was anger. There was grief. There is still grief. But there is also something else, a strange, bruised kind of gratitude that my grandmother loved her enough to try to protect her, even if the protection was itself a wound. We have since worked with the county to properly locate and identify Margaret's remains. The legal process is ongoing, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but she will be given a proper burial. Her name will be on a stone. There will be flowers. Penny is sitting on my bookshelf now. I don't know what she means anymore exactly. She's both the toy I lost when I was 6 and the accidental monument to a woman I never got to meet. She's both a thing of comfort and a thing of grief. But she is home, and Margaret, in whatever way is still possible, is coming home too. If you are watching this and you have a memory you've pushed aside, something you saw as a child that didn't quite make sense, I am not telling you to chase it. Some things are buried for reasons. Some truths have real costs. But sometimes the thing you thought you were wrong about, the thing you convinced yourself you misremembered, sometimes you were right. And sometimes the wrong people are carrying a weight that was never meant to be theirs. My grandmother carried Margaret for 30 years. She didn't have to. She made a choice out of love and fear and the terrible calculus of grief. I don't think she made the right one, but I understand her. That is the most complicated thing I've ever had to hold, and I'm still learning how. Thank you for being here with me for this one. It matters more than you know to say this out loud, to have witnesses. My name is in the comments if you want to talk. I'll try to answer what I can. Take care of the people you love. And if you know something that someone else deserves to know, think carefully about the cost of silence. It compounds over time in ways you cannot predict.